The Diary of a Madman, an insightful short story by Nikolai Gogol. October 3rd. A strange occurrence has taken place today. I got up fairly late, and when Maura brought me my clean boots, I asked her how late it was. When I heard it had long struck 10, I dressed as quickly as possible. To tell the truth, I would rather not have gone to the office at all today, for I know beforehand that our department chief will look as sour as vinegar. For some time past he has been in the habit of saying to me, "Look here, my friend, there is something wrong with your head. You often rush about as though you were possessed. Then you make such confused abstracts of the documents that the devil himself cannot make them out. You write the title without any capital letters and add neither the date nor the docket number." The long-legged scoundrel. He is certainly envious of me because I sit in the director's workroom and mend His Excellency's pens. In a word, I should not have gone to the office if I had not hoped to meet the accountant and perhaps squeeze a little advance out of this skinflint. A terrible man, this accountant, as for his advancing one's salary once in a way. You might sooner expect the skies to fall. You may beg and beseech him, and be on the very verge of ruin. This grey devil won't budge an inch. At the same time, his own cook at home, as all the world knows, boxes his ears. I really don't see what good one gets by serving in our department. There are no plums there. In the fiscal and judicial offices, it is quite different. There some ungainly fellow sits in a corner and writes and writes. He has such a shabby coat and such an ugly mug that one would like to spit on both of them. But you should see what a splendid country house he has rented. He would not condescend to accept a gilt porcelain cup as a present. "You can give that to your family doctor," he would say. Nothing less than a pair of chestnut horses, a fine carriage, or a beaver fur coat worth 300 rubles would be good enough for him. And yet he seems so mild and quiet, and asks so amiably, "Please lend me your penknife. I wish to mend my pen." Nevertheless, he knows how to scarify a petitioner till he has hardly a whole stitch left on his body. In our office, it must be admitted, everything is done in a proper and gentlemanly way. There is more cleanness and elegance than one will ever find in government offices. The tables are mahogany, and everyone is addressed as Sir. And truly, were it not for this official propriety, I should long ago have sent in my resignation. I put on my old cloak and took my umbrella as a light rain was falling. No one was to be seen on the streets except some women who had flung their skirts over their heads. Here and there one saw a cabman or a shopman with his umbrella up. Of the higher classes one only saw an official here and there. One I saw at the street crossing and thought to myself, "Ah, my friend, you are not going to the office, but after that young lady who walks in front of you. You're just like the officers who run after every petticoat they see." As I was thus following the train of my thoughts, I saw a carriage stop before a shop just as I was passing it. I recognized it at once. It was our director's carriage. "He has nothing to do in the shop," I said to myself. "It must be his daughter." I pressed myself close against the wall. A lackey opened the carriage door, and as I had expected, she fluttered like a bird out of it. How proudly she looked right and left, how she drew her eyebrows together and shot lightnings from her eyes. Good heavens, I am lost, hopelessly lost. But why must she come out in such abominable weather? And yet they say women are so mad on their finery. She did not recognize me. I had wrapped myself as closely as possible in my cloak. It was dirty and old-fashioned, and I would not have liked to have been seen by her wearing it. Now they wear cloaks with long collars, but mine has only a short double collar, and the cloth is of inferior quality. Her little dog could not get into the shop and remained outside. I know this dog. Its name is Meggie. Before I had been standing there a minute, I heard a voice call, "Good day, Meggie." Who the deuce was that? I looked round and saw two ladies hurrying by under an umbrella, one old, the other fairly young. They had already passed me when I heard the same voice say again, "For shame, Meggie." What was that? I saw Meggie sniffing at a dog which ran behind the ladies. The deuce, I thought to myself. I'm not drunk. That happens pretty seldom. No, Fidel, you are wrong, I heard Meggie say quite distinctly. I was bow, wow, I was bow, wow, wow, very ill. What an extraordinary dog. I was, to tell the truth, quite amazed to hear it talk human language. But when I considered the matter well, I ceased to be astonished. In fact, such things have already happened in the world. It is said that in England a fish put its head out of water and said a word or two in such an extraordinary language that learned men have been puzzling over them for 3 years and have not succeeded in interpreting them yet. I also read in the paper of 2 cows who entered a shop and asked for a pound of tea. Meanwhile, what Meggie went on to say seemed to me still more remarkable. She added, I wrote to you lately, Fidel. Perhaps Polken did not bring you the letter. Now I am willing to forfeit a whole month's salary if I ever heard of dogs writing before. This has certainly astonished me. For some little time past, I hear and see things which no other man has heard and seen. I will, I thought, follow that dog in order to get to the bottom of the matter. Accordingly, I opened my umbrella and went after the 2 ladies. They went down Bean Street, turned through Citizen Street and Carpenter Street, and finally halted on the Cuckoo Bridge before a large house. I know this house. It is Sverkov's. What a monster he is. What sort of people live there? How many cooks? How many bagmen? There are brother officials of mine also there packed on each other like herrings, and I have a friend there, a fine player on the cornet. The ladies mounted to the 5th story. Very good, thought I. I will make a note of the number in order to follow up the matter at the first opportunity. October 4th. Today is Wednesday, and I was as usual in the office. I came early on purpose, sat down, and mended all the pens. Our director must be a very clever man. The whole room is full of bookcases. I read the titles of some of the books. They were very learned, beyond the comprehension of people of my class, and all in French and German. I look at his face. See how much dignity there is in his eyes. I never hear a single superfluous word from his mouth, except that when he hands over the documents, he asks, What sort of weather is it? No, he is not a man of our class. He is a real statesman. I have already noticed that I am a special favourite of his. If now his daughter also, what folly, let me say no more about it. I have read the Northern Bee. What foolish people the French are. By heavens, I should like to tackle them all and give them a thrashing. I have also read a fine description of a ball given by a landowner of Kursk. The landowners of Kursk write a fine style. Then I noticed that it was already 12:30, and the director had not yet left his bedroom. But about 1:30, something happened which no pen can describe. The door opened. I thought it was the director. I jumped up with my documents from the seat, and then she, herself, came into the room. Yes, saints, how beautifully she was dressed. Her garments were whiter than a swan's plumage. Oh, how splendid! A sun, indeed, a real sun. She greeted me and asked, Has not my father come yet? Ah, what a voice! A canary bird. A real canary bird. Your Excellency, I wanted to exclaim, don't have me executed, but if it must be done, then kill me rather with your own angelic hand. But God knows why I could not bring it out, so I only said, No, he has not come yet. She glanced at me, looked at the books, and let her handkerchief fall. Instantly I started up, but slipped on the infernal polished floor and nearly broke my nose. Still, I succeeded in picking up the handkerchief. Yeah, heavenly choirs, what a handkerchief! So tender and soft, of the finest cambric. It had the scent of a general's rank. She thanked me, and smiled so amiably that her sugar lips nearly melted. Then she left the room. After I had sat there about an hour, a flunkey came in and said, You can go home, Mr. Ivanovitch. The director has already gone out. I cannot stand these lackeys. They hang about the vestibules and scarcely vouchsafe to greet one with a nod. Yes, sometimes it is even worse. Once one of these rascals offered me his snuff-box without even getting up from his chair. Don't you know then, you country bumpkin, that I am an official and of aristocratic birth? This time, however, I took my hat and overcoat quietly. These people naturally never think of helping one on with it. I went home, lay a good while on the bed, and wrote some verses in my note. "'Tis an hour since I saw thee, and it seems a whole long year. If I loathe my own existence, how can I live on, my dear?" I think they are by Pushkin. In the evening I wrapped myself in my cloak, hastened to the director's house, and waited there a long time to see if she would come out and get into the carriage. I only wanted to see her once, but she did not come. November 6th. Our chief clerk has gone mad. When I came to the office today, he called me to his room and began as follows. "Look here, my friend, what wild ideas have got into your head?" "How? What?" "None at all," I answered. "Consider well. You're already past 40. It is quite time to be reasonable. What do you imagine? Do you think I don't know all your tricks? Are you trying to pay court to the director's daughter? Look at yourself and realize what you are. A non-entity, nothing else. I would not give a kopeck for you. Look well in the glass. How can you have such thoughts with such a caricature of a face? May the devil take him. Because his own face has a certain resemblance to a medicine bottle, because he has a curly bush of hair on his head, and sometimes combs it upwards, and sometimes plasters it down in all kinds of queer ways. He thinks that he can do everything. I know well. I know why he is angry with me. He is envious. Perhaps he has noticed the tokens of favor which have been graciously shown me. But why should I bother about him? A counselor? What sort of important animal is that? He wears a gold chain with his watch, buys himself boots at 30 rubles a pair. May the deuce take him. Am I a tailor's son, or some other obscure cabbage? I am a nobleman. I can also work my way up. I am just 42, an age when a man's real career generally begins. Wait a bit, my friend. I too may get to a superior's rank, or perhaps, if God is gracious, even to a higher one. I shall make a name which will far outstrip yours. You think there are no able men except yourself. I only need to order a fashionable coat and wear a tie like yours, and you would be quite eclipsed. But I have no money. That is the worst part of it. November 8th. I was at the theatre. The Russian House Fool was performed. I laughed heartily. There was also a kind of musical comedy which contained amusing hits at barristers. The language was very broad. I wonder the censor passed it. In the comedy lines occur which accuse the merchants of cheating. Their sons are said to lead immoral lives and to behave very disrespectfully towards the nobility. The critics also are criticized. They are said only to be able to find fault, so that authors have to beg the public for protection. Our modern dramatists certainly write amusing things. I am very fond of the theatre. If I have only a kopeck in my pocket, I always go there. Most of my fellow officials are uneducated boors and never enter a theatre unless one throws free tickets at their head. One actress sang divinely. I thought also of, but silence, November 9th. About 8 o'clock I went to the office. The chief clerk pretended not to notice my arrival. I, for my part, also behaved as though he were not in existence. I read through and collated documents. About 4 o'clock I left. I passed by the director's house, but no one was to be seen. After dinner, I lay for a good while on the bed. November 11th. Today I sat in the director's room, mended 23 pens for him, and for her excellence, his daughter, 4 more. The director likes to see many pens lying on his table. What a head he must have. He continually wraps himself in silence, but I don't think the smallest trifle escapes his eye. I should like to know what he is generally thinking of, what is really going on in this brain. I should like to get acquainted with the whole manner of life of these gentlemen and get a closer view of their cunning courtiers' arts and all the activities of these circles. I have often thought of asking His Excellence about them, but the deuce knows why. Every time my tongue failed me, and I could get nothing out but my meteorological report. I wish I could get a look into the spare room whose door I so often see open, and a second small room behind the spare room excites my curiosity. How splendidly it is fitted up, what a quantity of mirrors and choice china it contains. I should also like to cast a glance into those regions where Her Excellency, the daughter, wields the scepter. I should like to see how all the scent bottles and boxes are arranged in her boudoir, and the flowers which exhale so delicious a scent that one is half afraid to breathe, and her clothes lying about which are too ethereal to be called clothes, but silence. Today there came to me what seemed a heavenly inspiration. I remembered the conversation between the two dogs which I had overheard on the Nevsky Prospect. Very good, I thought. Now I see my way clear. I must get hold of the correspondence which these two silly dogs have carried on with each other. In it, I shall probably find many things explained. I had already once called Meggie to me and said to her, "Listen, Meggie, now we are alone together. If you like, I will also shut the door so that no one can see us. Tell me now all that you know about your mistress. I swear to you that I will tell no one." But the cunning dog drew in its tail, ruffled up its hair, and went quite quietly out of the door, as though it had heard nothing. I had long been of the opinion that dogs are much cleverer than men. I also believed that they could talk, and that only a certain obstinacy kept them from doing so. They are especially watchful animals, and nothing escapes their observation. Now, cost what it may, I will go tomorrow to Sverkov's house, in order to ask after Fidel, and if I have luck, to get hold of all the letters which Meggie has written to her. November 12th. Today, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I started in order, by some means or other, to see Fidel and question her. I cannot stand this smell of sauerkraut, which assails one's olfactory nerves from all the shops in Citizen Street. There also exhales such an odour from under each house door that one must hold one's nose and pass by quickly. There ascends also so much smoke and soot from the artisans' shops that it is almost impossible to get through it. When I had climbed up to the 6th story and had rung the bell, a rather pretty girl with a freckled face came out. I recognized her as the companion of the old lady. She blushed a little and asked, "What do you want?" "I want to have a little conversation with your dog." She was a simple-minded girl, as I saw at once. The dog came running and barking loudly. I wanted to take hold of it, but the abominable beast nearly caught hold of my nose with its teeth. But in a corner of the room I saw its sleeping basket. Ah, that was what I wanted. I went to it, rummaged in the straw, and to my great satisfaction drew out a little packet of small pieces of paper. When the hideous little dog saw this, it first bit me in the calf of the leg, and then, as soon as it had become aware of my theft, it began to whimper and to fawn on me. But I said, "No, you little beast, goodbye," and hastened away. I believe the girl thought me mad. At any rate, she was thoroughly alarmed. When I reached my room, I wished to get to work at once and read through the letters by daylight, since I do not see well by candlelight. But the wretched Mara had got the idea of sweeping the floor. These blockheads of Finnish women are always clean where there is no need to be. I then went for a little walk and began to think over what had happened. Now, at last, I could get to the bottom of all facts, ideas, and motives. These letters would explain everything. Dogs are clever fellows. They know all about politics, and I will certainly find in the letters all I want, especially the character of the director and all his relationships. And through these letters, I will get information about her who... But silence. Towards evening I came home and lay for a good while on the bed. November 13th. Now let us see. The letter is fairly legible, but the handwriting is somewhat doggish. Dear Fidel, I cannot get accustomed to your ordinary name, as if they could not have found a better one for you. Fidel, how tasteless, how ordinary. But this is not the time to discuss it. I am very glad that we thought of corresponding with each other. The letter is quite correctly written. The punctuation and spelling are perfectly right. Even our head clerk does not write so simply and clearly, though he declares he has been at the university. Let us go on. I think that it is one of the most refined joys of this world to interchange thoughts, feelings, and impressions. This idea comes from some book which has been translated from German. I can't remember the title. I speak from experience, although I have not gone farther into the world than just before our front door. Does not my life pass happily and comfortably? My mistress, whom her father calls Sophie, is quite in love with me. But better be silent. Her father also often strokes me. I drink tea and coffee with cream. Yes, my dear, I must confess to you that I find no satisfaction in those large, gnawed-at bones which Polken devours in the kitchen. Only the bones of wild fowl are good, and that only when the marrow has not been sucked out of them. They taste very nice with a little sauce, but there should be no green stuff in it. But I know nothing worse than the habit of giving dogs balls of bread kneaded up. Someone sits at table, kneads a bread ball with dirty fingers, calls you, and sticks it in your mouth. Good manners forbid your refusing it, and you eat it. With disgust, it is true, but you eat it. The deuce! What is this? What rubbish! As if she could find nothing more suitable to write about. I will see if there is anything more reasonable on the second page. I am quite willing to inform you of everything that goes on here. I have already mentioned the most important person in the house, whom Sophie calls Papa. He is a very strange man. Here we are at last. Yes, I knew it. They have a politician's penetrating eye for all things. Let us see what she says about Papa. A strange man. Generally, he is silent. He only speaks seldom, but about a week ago he kept on repeating to himself, "Shall I get it or not?" In one hand, he took a sheet of paper. The other he stretched out as though to receive something and repeated, "Shall I get it or not?" Once he turned to me with the question, "What do you think, Meggie?" I did not understand in the least what he meant, sniffed at his boots, and went away. A week later, he came home with his face beaming. That morning he was visited by several officers in uniform who congratulated him. At the dinner table, he was in a better humor than I have ever seen him before. He is ambitious, then. I must make a note of that. Pardon, my dear, I hasten to conclude, etc., etc. Tomorrow I will finish the letter. Now, good morning. Here I am again at your service. Today, my mistress Sophie. We will see what she says about Sophie. Let us go on. Was in an unusually excited state. She went to a ball, and I was glad that I could write to you in her absence. She likes going to balls, although she gets dreadfully irritated while dressing. I cannot understand, my dear, what is the pleasure in going to a ball. She comes home from the ball at 6 o'clock in the early morning, and to judge by her pale and emaciated face, she has had nothing to eat. I could, frankly speaking, not endure such an existence. If I could not get partridge with sauce, or the wing of a roast chicken, I don't know what I should do. Porridge with sauce is also tolerable, but I can get up no enthusiasm for carrots, turnips, and artichokes. The style is very unequal. One sees at once that it has not been written by a man. The beginning is quite intelligent, but at the end the canine nature breaks out. I will read another letter. It is rather long, and there is no date. My dear, how delightful is the arrival of spring. My heart beats as though it expected something. There is a perpetual ringing in my ears, so that I often stand with my foot raised for several minutes at a time and listen towards the door. In confidence, I will tell you that I have many admirers. I often sit on the window-sill and let them pass in review. If you knew what miscreations there are among them. One, a clumsy house dog, with stupidity written on his face, walks the street with an important air, and imagines that he is an extremely important person, and that the eyes of all the world are fastened on him. I don't pay him the least attention, and pretend not to see him at all. And what a hideous bulldog has taken up his post opposite my window. If he stood on his hind legs, as the monster probably cannot, he would be taller by a head than my mistress's papa, who himself has a stately figure. This lout seems, moreover, to be very impudent. I growl at him, but he does not seem to mind that at all. If he at least would only wrinkle his forehead. Instead of that, he stretches out his tongue, droops his big ears, and stares in at the window. This rustic boor. But do you think, my dear, that my heart remains proof against all temptations? Alas, no. If you had only seen that gentlemanly dog who crept through the fence of the neighbouring house, Treasure is his name. Ah, my dear, what a delightful snout he has. To the deuce with the stuff. What rubbish it is. How can one blacken paper with such absurdities? Give me a man. I want to see a man. I need some food to nourish and refresh my mind, and get this silliness instead. I will turn the page to see if there is anything better on the other side. Sophie sat at the table and sewed something. I looked out of the window and amused myself by watching the passers-by. Suddenly a flunky entered and announced a visitor, Mr. Teploff. "Show him in," said Sophie, and began to embrace me. "Ah, Meggie, do you know who that is? He is dark and belongs to the royal household, and what eyes he has, dark and brilliant as fire." Sophie hastened into her room. A minute later, a young gentleman with black whiskers entered. He went to the mirror, smoothed his hair, and looked round the room. I turned away and sat down in my place. Sophie entered and returned his bow in a friendly manner. I pretended to observe nothing and continued to look out of the window, but I leant my head a little on one side to hear what they were talking about. Ah, my dear, what silly things they discussed. How a lady executed the wrong figure in dancing. How a certain Boboff, with his expansive shirt frill, had looked like a stork and nearly fallen down. How a certain Lidina imagined she had blue eyes when they were really green, etc. I do not know, my dear, what special charm she finds in her Mr. Teploff, and why she is so delighted with him. It seems to me myself that there is something wrong here. It is impossible that this Teploff should bewitch her. We will see further. If this gentleman of the household pleases her, then she must also be pleased, according to my view, with that official who sits in her papa's writing-room. Ah, my dear, if you know what a figure he is. A regular tortoise. What official does she mean? He has an extraordinary name. He always sits there and mends the pens. His hair looks like a truss of hay. Her papa always employs him instead of a servant. I believe this abominable little beast is referring to me. But what has my hair got to do with hay? Sophie can never keep from laughing when she sees him. You lie, cursed dog. What a scandalous tongue. As if I did not know that it is envy which prompts you, and that here there is treachery at work. Yes, the treachery of the chief clerk. This man hates me implacably. He has plotted against me. He is always seeking to injure me. I'll look through one more letter. Perhaps it will make the matter clearer. Fidèle, my dear, pardon me that I have not written for so long. I was floating in a dream of delight. In truth, some author remarks, love is a second life. Besides, great changes are going on in the house. The young chamberlain is always here. Sophie is wildly in love with him. Her papa is quite contented. I heard from Gregor, who sweeps the floor and is in the habit of talking to himself, that the marriage will soon be celebrated. Her papa will at any rate get his daughter married to a general, a colonel, or a chamberlain. Deuce take it, I can read no more. It is all about chamberlains and generals. I should like myself to be a general, not in order to sue for her hand and all that. No, not at all. I should like to be a general merely in order to see people wriggling, squirming, and hatching plots before me, and then I should like to tell them that they are both of them not worth spitting on. But it is vexatious. I tear the foolish dog's letters up in 1,000 pieces. December 3rd. It is not possible that the marriage should take place. It is only idle gossip. What does it signify if he is a chamberlain? That is only a dignity, not a substantial thing which one can see or handle. His chamberlain's office will not procure him a third eye in his forehead. Neither is his nose made of gold. It is just like mine, or anyone else's nose. He does not eat and cough, but smells and sneezes with it. I should like to get to the bottom of the mystery. Whence do all these distinctions come? Why am I only a titular counsellor? Perhaps I am really a count or a general, and only appear to be a titular counsellor. Perhaps I don't even know who and what I am. How many cases there are in history of a simple gentleman, or even a burgher or peasant, suddenly turning out to be a great lord or baron. Well, suppose that I appear suddenly in a general's uniform, on the right shoulder an epaulet, on the left an epaulet, and a blue sash across my breast. What sort of a tune would my beloved sing then? What would her papa, our director, say? Oh, he is ambitious. He is a Freemason, certainly a Freemason. However much he may conceal it, I have found it out. When he gives anyone his hand, he only reaches out 2 fingers. Well, could not I this minute be nominated a general or a superintendent? I should like to know why I am a titular counsellor. Why just that, and nothing more? December 5th. Today I have been reading papers the whole morning. Very strange things are happening in Spain. I have not understood them all. It is said that the throne is vacant. The representatives of the people are in difficulties about finding an occupant, and riots are taking place. All this appears to me very strange. How can the throne be vacant? It is said that it will be occupied by a woman. A woman cannot sit on a throne. That is impossible. Only a king can sit on a throne. They say that there is no king there, but that is not possible. There cannot be a kingdom without a king. There must be a king, but he is hidden away somewhere. Perhaps he is actually on the spot, and only some domestic complications or fears of the neighbouring powers, France and other countries, compel him to remain in concealment. There might also be other reasons. December 8th. I was nearly going to the office, but various considerations kept me from doing so. I keep on thinking about these Spanish affairs. How is it possible that a woman should reign? It would not be allowed, especially by England. In the rest of Europe, the political situation is also critical. The Emperor of Austria. These events, to tell the truth, have so shaken and shattered me that I could really do nothing all day. Mara told me that I was very absent-minded at table. In fact, in my absent-mindedness, I threw 2 plates on the ground so that they broke in pieces. After dinner, I felt weak and did not feel up to making abstracts of reports. I lay most of the time on my bed and thought of the Spanish affairs. The year 2000, April 43rd. Today is a day of splendid triumph. Spain has a king. He has been found, and I am he. I discovered it today. All of a sudden it came upon me like a flash of lightning. I do not understand how I could imagine that I am a titular counsellor. How could such a foolish idea enter my head? It was fortunate that it occurred to no one to shut me up in an asylum. Now it is all clear, and as plain as a pikestaff. Formerly, I don't know why, everything seemed veiled in a kind of mist. That is, I believe, because people think that the human brain is in the head. Nothing of the sort. It is carried by the wind from the Caspian Sea. For the first time I told Mara who I am. When she learned that the King of Spain stood before her, she struck her hands together over her head and nearly died of alarm. The stupid thing had never seen the King of Spain before. I comforted her, however, at once by assuring her that I was not angry with her for having hitherto cleaned my boots badly. Women are stupid things. One cannot interest them in lofty subjects. She was frightened because she thought all kings of Spain were like Philip II. But I explained to her that there was a great difference between me and him. I did not go to the office. Why the deuce should I? No, my dear friends, you won't get me there again. I am not going to worry myself with your infernal documents anymore. Marchember 86, between day and night. Today, the office messenger came and summoned me, as I had not been there for 3 weeks. I went just for the fun of the thing. The chief clerk thought I would bow humbly before him and make excuses, but I looked at him quite indifferently, neither angrily nor mildly, and sat down quietly at my place as though I noticed no one. I looked at all this rabble of scribblers and thought, if you only knew who is sitting among you, good heavens, what a to-do you would make. Even the chief clerk would bow himself to the earth before me as he does now before the director. A pile of reports was laid before me, of which to make abstracts, but I did not touch them with one finger. After a little time, there was a commotion in the office, and there a report went round that the director was coming. Many of the clerks vied with each other to attract his notice, but I did not stir. As he came through our room, each one hastily buttoned up his coat, but I had no idea of doing anything of the sort. What is the director to me? Should I stand up before him? Never. What sort of a director is he? He is a bottle stopper, and no director. A quite ordinary, simple bottle stopper. Nothing more. I felt quite amused as they gave me a document to sign. They thought I would simply put down my name. So-and-so, clerk. Why not? But at the top of the sheet, where the director generally writes his name, I inscribed, Ferdinand VIII, in bold characters. You should have seen what a reverential silence ensued. But I made a gesture with my hand and said, Gentlemen, no ceremony, please. Then I went out and took my way straight to the director's house. He was not at home. The flunky wanted not to let me in, but I talked to him in such a way that he soon dropped his arms. I went straight to Sophie's dressing room. She sat before the mirror. When she saw me, she sprang up and took a step backwards, but I did not tell her that I was the King of Spain. But I told her that a happiness awaited her beyond her power to imagine, and that in spite of all our enemies' devices, we should be united. That was all which I wished to say to her, and I went out. Oh, what cunning creatures these women are! Now I have found out what woman really is. Hitherto no one knew whom a woman really loves. I am the first to discover it. She loves the devil. Yes, joking apart, learned men write nonsense when they pronounce that she is this and that. She loves the devil, that is all. You see a woman looking through her lorgnette from a box in the front row. One thinks she is watching that stout gentleman who wears an order. Not a bit of it. She is watching the devil who stands behind his back. He has hidden himself there and beckons to her with his finger. And she marries him. Actually, she marries him. That is all ambition, and the reason is that there is under the tongue a little blister in which there is a little worm of the size of a pin's head, and this is constructed by a barber in Bean Street. I don't remember his name at the moment, but so much is certain that, in conjunction with a midwife, he wants to spread Mohammedanism all over the world, and that in consequence of this, a large number of people in France have already adopted the faith of Islam. No date. The day had no date. I went for a walk incognito on the Nevsky Prospect. I avoided every appearance of being the King of Spain. I felt it below my dignity to let myself be recognized by the whole world, since I must first present myself at court. And I was also restrained by the fact that I have at present no Spanish national costume. If I could only get a cloak. I tried to have a consultation with a tailor, but these people are real asses. Moreover, they neglect their business, dabble in speculation, and have become loafers. I will have a cloak made out of my new official uniform, which I have only worn twice. But to prevent this botcher of a tailor spoiling it, I will make it myself with closed doors, so that no one sees me. Since the cut must be altogether altered, I have used the scissors myself. I don't remember the date. The devil knows what month it was. The cloak is quite ready. Mara exclaimed aloud when I put it on. I will, however, not present myself at court yet. The Spanish deputation has not yet arrived. It would not be befitting if I appeared without them. My appearance would be less imposing. From hour to hour I expect them. The first. The extraordinary long delay of the deputies in coming astonishes me. What can possibly keep them? Perhaps France has a hand in the matter. It is certainly hostilely inclined. I went to the post office to inquire whether the Spanish deputation had come. The postmaster is an extraordinary blockhead who knows nothing. No, he said to me. "There is no Spanish deputation here. But if you want to send them a letter, we will forward it at the fixed rate." The deuce! What do I want with a letter? Letters are nonsense. Letters are written by apothecaries. Madrid, February 30th. So I am in Spain after all. It has happened so quickly that I could hardly take it in. The Spanish deputies came early this morning, and I got with them into the carriage. This unexpected promptness seemed to me strange. We drove so quickly that in half an hour we were at the Spanish frontier. Over all Europe now there are cast-iron roads, and the steamers go very fast. A wonderful country, this Spain. As we entered the first room, I saw numerous persons with shorn heads. I guessed at once that they must be either grandees or soldiers, at least to judge by their shorn heads. The Chancellor of the State, who led me by the hand, seemed to me to behave in a very strange way. He pushed me into a little room and said, "Stay here, and if you call yourself King Ferdinand again, I will drive the wish to do so out of you." I knew, however, that that was only a test, and I reasserted my conviction, on which the Chancellor gave me 2 such severe blows with a stick on the back that I could have cried out with the pain. But I restrained myself, remembering that this was a usual ceremony of old-time chivalry when one was inducted into a high position, and in Spain the laws of chivalry prevail up to the present day. When I was alone, I determined to study state affairs. I discovered that Spain and China are one and the same country, and it is only through ignorance that people regard them as separate kingdoms. I advise everyone urgently to write down the word Spain on a sheet of paper. He will see that it is quite the same as China. But I feel much annoyed by an event which is about to take place tomorrow. At 7 o'clock, the Earth is going to sit on the moon. This is foretold by the famous English chemist, Wellington. To tell the truth, I often felt uneasy when I thought of the excessive brittleness and fragility of the moon. The moon is generally repaired in Hamburg, and very imperfectly. It is done by a lame cooper, an obvious blockhead who has no idea how to do it. He took wax thread and olive oil, hence that pungent smell over all the earth which compels people to hold their noses, and this makes the moon so fragile that no men can live on it, but only noses. Therefore, we cannot see our noses, because they are on the moon. When I now pictured to myself how the earth, that massive body, would crush our noses to dust if it sat on the moon, I became so uneasy that I immediately put on my shoes and stockings and hastened into the council hall to give the police orders to prevent the earth sitting on the moon. The grandees with the shorn heads, whom I met in great numbers in the hall, were very intelligent people, and when I exclaimed, "Gentlemen, let us save the moon, for the earth is going to sit on it," they all set to work to fulfill my imperial wish, and many of them clambered up the wall in order to take the moon down. At that moment, the imperial chancellor came in. As soon as he appeared, they all scattered, but I alone, as king, remained. To my astonishment, however, the chancellor beat me with the stick and drove me to my room. So powerful are ancient customs in Spain. January in the same year, following after February. I can never understand what kind of a country this Spain really is. The popular customs and rules of court etiquette are quite extraordinary. I do not understand them at all. Today my head was shorn, although I exclaimed as loudly as I could that I did not want to be a monk. What happened afterwards, when they began to let cold water trickle on my head, I do not know. I have never experienced such hellish torments. I nearly went mad, and they had difficulty in holding me. The significance of this strange custom is entirely hidden from me. It is a very foolish and unreasonable one, nor can I understand the stupidity of the kings who have not done away with it before now. Judging by all the circumstances, it seems to me as though I had fallen into the hands of the Inquisition, and as though the man whom I took to be the Chancellor was the Grand Inquisitor. But yet, I cannot understand how the king could fall into the hands of the Inquisition. The affair may have been arranged by France, especially Polignac. He is a hound, that Polignac. He has sworn to compass my death, and now he is hunting me down. But I know, my friend, that you are only a tool of the English. They are clever fellows, and have a finger in every pie. All the world knows that France sneezes when England takes a pinch of snuff. The 25th. Today, the Grand Inquisitor came into my room. When I heard his steps in the distance, I hid myself under a chair. When he did not see me, he began to call. At first he called Poprishchin. I made no answer. Then he called Aksanti Ivanovich, titular councillor, nobleman. I still kept silence. Ferdinand VIII, King of Spain. I was on the point of putting out my head, but I thought, no, brother, you shall not deceive me. You shall not pour water on my head again. But he had already seen me and drove me from under the chair with his stick. The cursed stick really hurts one. But the following discovery compensated me for all the pain. That is, that every cock has his Spain under his feathers. The Grand Inquisitor went angrily away and threatened me with some punishment or other. I felt only contempt for his powerless spite, for I know that he only works like a machine, like a tool of the English. 34 March, February 349. No, I have no longer power to endure. Oh God, what are they going to do with me? They pour cold water on my head. They take no notice of me and seem neither to see nor hear. Why do they torture me? What do they want from one so wretched as myself? What can I give them? I possess nothing. I cannot bear all their tortures. My head aches as though everything were turning round in a circle. Save me! Carry me away! Give me 3 steeds swift as the wind. Mount your seat, coachman. Ring bells, gallop horses, and carry me straight out of this world. Farther, ever farther, till nothing more is to be seen. Ah, the heaven bends over me already. A star glimmers in the distance. The forest with its dark trees in the moonlight rushes past. A bluish mist floats under my feet. Music sounds in the cloud. On the one side is the sea, on the other Italy. Beyond I also see Russian peasants' houses. Is not my parents' house there in the distance? Does not my mother sit by the window? Oh, mother, mother, save your unhappy son. Let a tear fall on his aching head. See how they torture him. Press the poor orphan to your bosom. He has no rest in this world. They hunt him from place to place. Mother, mother, have pity on your sick child. And do you know that the Bey of Algiers has a wart under his nose? The Cloak, a short story by Nikolai Gogol, in the department of... But it is better not to mention the department. The touchiest things in the world are departments, regiments, courts of justice, in a word, all branches of public service. Each individual nowadays thinks all society insulted in his person. Quite recently, a complaint was received from a district chief of police in which he plainly demonstrated that all the imperial institutions were going to the dogs and that the Tsar's sacred name was being taken in vain. And in proof, he appended to the complaint a romance in which the district chief of police is made to appear about once in every 10 pages and sometimes in a downright drunken condition. Therefore, in order to avoid all unpleasantness, it will be better to designate the department in question as a certain department. So, in a certain department, there was a certain official, not a very notable one, it must be allowed, short of stature, somewhat pockmarked, red-haired and mole-eyed, with a bald forehead, wrinkled cheeks, and a complexion of the kind known as sanguine. The St. Petersburg climate was responsible for this. As for his official rank, with us Russians the rank comes first, he was what is called a perpetual titular councillor, over which, as is well known, some writers make merry and crack their jokes, obeying the praiseworthy custom of attacking those who cannot bite back. His family name was Bashmachkin. This name is evidently derived from bashmak, shoe, but when, at what time, and in what manner, is not known. His father and grandfather and all the Bashmachkins always wore boots, which were resoled 2 or 3 times a year. His name was Akaki Akakievich. It may strike the reader as rather singular and far-fetched, but he may rest assured that it was by no means far-fetched, and that the circumstances were such that it would have been impossible to give him any other. This was how it came about. Akaki Akakievich was born, if my memory fails me not, in the evening on the 23rd of March. His mother, the wife of a government official and a very fine woman, made all due arrangements for having the child baptized. She was lying on the bed opposite the door. On her right stood the godfather, Ivan Ivanovich Eroshkin, a most estimable man who served as the head clerk of the Senate, and the godmother, Arina Semyonovna Bielobrinskova, the wife of an officer of the quarter and a woman of rare virtues. They offered the mother her choice of 3 names, Mokia, Sosia, or that the child should be called after the martyr Kozdazat. "No," said the good woman, "all those names are poor." In order to please her, they opened the calendar at another place. 3 more names appeared, Trifoli, Dula, and Varakasi. "This is awful," said the old woman. "What names! I truly never heard the like. I might have put up with Varadat or Varuk, but not Trifoli and Varakasi." They turned to another page and found Pavsikaki and Vaktisi. "Now I see," said the old woman, "that it is plainly fate. And since such is the case, it will be better to name him after his father. His father's name was Akaki, so let his son's name be Akaki too." In this manner he became Akaki Akakievich. They christened the child, whereat he wept and made a grimace, as though he foresaw that he was to be a titular councillor. In this manner did it all come about. We have mentioned it in order that the reader might see for himself that it was a case of necessity, and that it was utterly impossible to give him any other name. When and how he entered the department, and who appointed him, no one could remember. However much the directors and chiefs of all kinds were changed, he was always to be seen in the same place, the same attitude, the same occupation, always the letter-copying clerk, so that it was afterwards affirmed that he had been born in uniform with a bald head. No respect was shown him in the department. The porter not only did not rise from his seat when he passed, but never even glanced at him, any more than if a fly had flown through the reception room. His superiors treated him in coolly despotic fashion. Some insignificant assistant to the head clerk would thrust a paper under his nose without so much as saying, "Copy," or "Here's an interesting little case," or anything else agreeable, as is customary amongst well-bred officials. And he took it, looking only at the paper and not observing who handed it to him or whether he had the right to do so, simply took it and set about copying it. The young officials laughed at and made fun of him so far as their official wit permitted, told in his presence various stories concocted about him and about his landlady, an old woman of 70, declared that she beat him, asked when the wedding was to be, and strewed bits of paper over his head, calling them snow. But Akaki Akakievich answered not a word, any more than if there had been no one there besides himself. It even had no effect upon his work. Amid all these annoyances, he never made a single mistake in a letter. But if the joking became wholly unbearable, as when they jogged his head and prevented his attending to his work, he would exclaim, "Leave me alone! Why do you insult me?" And there was something strange in the words and the voice in which they were uttered. There was in it something which moved to pity, so much so that one young man, a newcomer, who, taking pattern by the others, had permitted himself to make sport of Akaki, suddenly stopped short, as though all about him had undergone a transformation and presented itself in a different aspect. Some unseen force repelled him from the comrades whose acquaintance he had made, on the supposition that they were decent, well-bred men. Long afterwards, in his gayest moments, there recurred to his mind the little official with the bald forehead, with his heart-rending words, "Leave me alone! Why do you insult me?" In these moving words other words resounded, "I am thy brother." And the young man covered his face with his hand. And many a time afterwards, in the course of his life, shuddered at seeing how much inhumanity there is in man, how much savage coarseness is concealed beneath refined, cultured, worldly refinement, and even, O God, in that man whom the world acknowledges as honourable and upright. It would be difficult to find another man who lived so entirely for his duties. It is not enough to say that Akaki laboured with zeal. No, he laboured with love. In his copying, he found a varied and agreeable employment. Enjoyment was written on his face. Some letters were even favourites with him. And when he encountered these, he smiled, winked, and worked with his lips, till it seemed as though each letter might be read in his face as his pen traced it. If his pay had been in proportion to his zeal, he would, perhaps, to his great surprise, have been made even a counsellor of state. But he worked, as his companions the wits put it, like a horse in a mill. However, it would be untrue to say that no attention was paid to him. One director, being a kindly man and desirous of rewarding him for his long service, ordered him to be given something more important than mere copying. So he was ordered to make a report of an already concluded affair to another department, the duty consisting simply in changing the heading and altering a few words from the first to the third person. This caused him so much toil that he broke into a perspiration, rubbed his forehead, and finally said, "No, give me rather something to copy." After that, they let him copy on forever. Outside this copying, it appeared that nothing existed for him. He gave no thought to his clothes. His uniform was not green, but a sort of rusty meal colour. The collar was low, so that his neck, in spite of the fact that it was not long, seemed inordinately so as it emerged from it, like the necks of the plaster cats which peddlers carry about on their heads. And something was always sticking to his uniform, either a bit of hay or some trifle. Moreover, he had a peculiar knack, as he walked along the street, of arriving beneath a window just as all sorts of rubbish was being flung out of it. Hence, he always bore about on his hat scraps of melon rinds and other such articles. Never once in his life did he give heed to what was going on every day to the street, while it is well known that his young brother officials trained the range of their glances till they could see when anyone's trouser straps came undone upon the opposite sidewalk, which always brought a malicious smile to their faces. But Akaki Akakievich saw in all things the clean, even strokes of his written lines, and only when a horse thrust his nose from some unknown quarter over his shoulder and sent a whole gust of wind down his neck from his nostrils, did he observe that he was not in the middle of a line, but in the middle of the street. On reaching home, he sat down at once at the table, sipped his cabbage soup up quickly, and swallowed a bit of beef with onions, never noticing their taste, and gulping down everything with flies and anything else which the Lord happened to send at the moment. When he saw that his stomach was beginning to swell, he rose from the table and copied papers which he had brought home. If there happened to be none, he took copies for himself, for his own gratification, especially if the document was noteworthy, not on account of its style, but of its being addressed to some distinguished person. Even at the hour when the grey St. Petersburg sky had quite disappeared, and all the official world had eaten or dined, each as he could, in accordance with the salary he received and his own fancy, when all were resting from the department jar of pens, running to and fro for their own and other people's indispensable occupations, and from all the work that an uneasy man makes willingly for himself rather than what is necessary. When officials hasten to dedicate to pleasure the time which is left to them, one bolder than the rest, going to the theatre, another into the street looking under the bonnets, another wasting his evening in compliments to some pretty girl, the star of a small official circle, another, and this is the common case of all, visiting his comrades on the third or fourth floor, in two small rooms with an ante-room or kitchen, and some pretensions to fashion, such as a lamp or some other trifle which has cost many a sacrifice of dinner or pleasure trip. In a word, at the hour when all officials disperse among the contracted quarters of their friends to play whist as they sip their tea from glasses with a kopek's worth of sugar, smoke long pipes, relate at times some bits of gossip which a Russian man can never, under any circumstances, refrain from, and when there is nothing else to talk of, repeat eternal anecdotes about the commandant to whom they had sent word that the tails of the horses on the Falconet Monument had been cut off. When all strive to divert themselves, Akaki Akakievich indulged in no kind of diversion. No one could even say that he had seen him at any kind of evening party. Having written to his heart's content, he lay down to sleep, smiling at the thought of the coming day, of what God might send him to copy on the morrow. Thus flowed on the peaceful life of the man, who, with a salary of 400 roubles, understood how to be content with his lot. And thus it would have continued to flow on, perhaps, to extreme old age, were it not that there are various ills strewn along the path of life for titular counsellors, as well as for private, actual, court, and every other species of counsellor, even to those who never give any advice or take any themselves. There exists in St. Petersburg a powerful foe of all who receive a salary of 400 roubles a year, or thereabouts. This foe is no other than the northern cold, although it is said to be very healthy. At 9 o'clock in the morning, at the very hour when the streets are filled with men bound for the various official departments, it begins to bestow such powerful and piercing nips on all noses impartially that the poor officials really do not know what to do with them. At an hour when the foreheads of even those who occupy exalted positions ache with the cold and tears start to their eyes, the poor titular counsellors are sometimes quite unprotected. Their only salvation lies in traversing as quickly as possible in their thin little cloaks 5 or 6 streets, and then warming their feet in the porter's room, and so thawing all their talents and qualifications for official service which had become frozen on the way. Akaki Akakievich had felt for some time that his back and shoulders were paining with peculiar poignancy, in spite of the fact that he tried to traverse the distance with all possible speed. He began finally to wonder whether the fault did not lie in his cloak. He examined it thoroughly at home, and discovered that in 2 places, namely, on the back and shoulders, it had become thin as gauze. The cloth was worn to such a degree that he could see through it, and the lining had fallen into pieces. You must know that Akaki Akakievich's cloak served as an object of ridicule to the officials. They even refused it the noble name of cloak and called it a cape. In fact, it was of singular make, its collar diminishing year by year to serve to patch its other parts. The patching did not exhibit great skill on the part of the tailor, and was, in fact, baggy and ugly. Seeing how the matter stood, Akaki Akakievich decided that it would be necessary to take the cloak to Petrovich, the tailor, who lived somewhere on the 4th floor up a dark staircase, and who, in spite of his having but one eye and pockmarks all over his face, busied himself with considerable success in repairing the trousers and coats of officials and others. That is to say, when he was sober and not nursing some other scheme in his head. It is not necessary to say much about this tailor, but as it is the custom to have the character of each personage in a novel clearly defined, there is no help for it. So here is Petrovich, the tailor. At first he was called only Grigory, and was some gentleman's serf. He commenced calling himself Petrovich from the time when he received his free papers, and further began to drink heavily on all holidays, at first on the great ones, and then on all church festivals without discrimination, wherever a cross stood in the calendar. On this point he was faithful to ancestral custom, and when quarrelling with his wife, he called her a low female and a German. As we have mentioned his wife, it will be necessary to say a word or two about her. Unfortunately, little is known of her beyond the fact that Petrovich had a wife who wore a cap and a dress, but could not lay claim to beauty. At least, no one but the soldiers of the guard even looked under her cap when they met her. Ascending the staircase which led to Petrovich's room, which staircase was all soaked with dishwater and reeked with the smell of spirits which affects the eyes, and is an inevitable adjunct to all dark stairways in St. Petersburg houses. Ascending the stairs, Akaki Akakievich pondered how much Petrovich would ask and mentally resolved not to give more than 2 rubles. The door was open, for the mistress, in cooking some fish, had raised such a smoke in the kitchen that not even the beetles were visible. Akaki Akakievich passed through the kitchen unperceived, even by the housewife, and at length reached a room where he beheld Petrovich seated on a large unpainted table with his legs tucked under him like a Turkish pasha. His feet were bare, after the fashion of tailors as they sit at work, and the first thing which caught the eye was his thumb, with a deformed nail thick and strong as a turtle's shell. About Petrovich's neck hung a skein of silk and thread, and upon his knees lay some old garment. He had been trying unsuccessfully for 3 minutes to thread his needle, and was enraged at the darkness and even at the thread, growling in a low voice, "It won't go through, the barbarian. You pricked me, you rascal." Akaki Akakievich was vexed at arriving at the precise moment when Petrovich was angry. He liked to order something of Petrovich when he was a little downhearted, or, as his wife expressed it, when he had settled himself with brandy, the one-eyed devil. Under such circumstances, Petrovich generally came down in his price very readily, and even bowed and returned thanks. Afterwards, to be sure, his wife would come, complaining that her husband had been drunk and so had fixed the price too low. But if only a 10 kopeck piece were added, then the matter would be settled. But now it appeared that Petrovich was in a sober condition, and therefore rough, taciturn, and inclined to demand, Satan only knows what price. Akaki Akakievich felt this, and would gladly have beat a retreat, but he was in for it. Petrovich screwed up his one eye very intently at him, and Akaki Akakievich involuntarily said, "How do you do, Petrovich?" "I wish you a good morning, sir," said Petrovich, squinting at Akaki Akakievich's hands to see what sort of booty he had brought. "Ah, to you, Petrovich, this—" It must be known that Akaki Akakievich expressed himself chiefly by prepositions, adverbs, and scraps of phrases which had no meaning whatever. If the matter was a very difficult one, he had a habit of never completing his sentences, so that frequently, having begun a phrase with the words, "This, in fact, is quite," he forgot to go on, thinking he had already finished it. "What is it?" asked Petrovich, and with his one eye scanned Akaki Akakievich's whole uniform from the collar down to the cuffs, the back, the tails, and the buttonholes, all of which were well known to him, since they were his own handiwork. Such is the habit of tailors. It is the first thing they do on meeting one. "But I hear this, Petrovich, a cloak, cloth. Here you see everywhere, in different places. It is quite strong. It is a little dusty and looks old, but it is new. Only here in one place it is a little on the back, and here on one of the shoulders. It is a little worn, yes. Here on this shoulder it is a little. Do you see? That is all. And a little work." Petrovich took the cloak, spread it out, to begin with, on the table, looked at it hard, shook his head, reached out his hand to the window-sill for his snuff-box, adorned with the portrait of some general, though what general is unknown, for the place where the face should have been had been rubbed through by the finger, and a square bit of paper had been pasted over it. Having taken a pinch of snuff, Petrovich held up the cloak and inspected it against the light, and again shook his head. Then he turned it, lining upwards, and shook his head once more. After which he again lifted the general-adorned lid with its bit of pasted paper, and having stuffed his nose with snuff, dosed and put away the snuff-box, and said finally, "No, it is impossible to mend it. It is a wretched garment." Akaki Akakievich's heart sank at these words. "Why is it impossible, Petrovich?" he said, almost in the pleading voice of a child. "All that ails it is that it is worn on the shoulders. You must have some pieces." "Yes, patches could be found. Patches are easily found," said Petrovich, "but there's nothing to sew them to. The thing is completely rotten. If you put a needle to it, see, it will give way. Let it give way, and you can put on another patch at once." But there is nothing to put the patches onto. There's no use in strengthening it. It is too far gone. It's lucky that it's cloth, for if the wind were to blow, it would fly away. Well, strengthen it again. How this, in fact? No, said Petrovich decisively. There is nothing to be done with it. It's a thoroughly bad job. You'd better, when the cold winter weather comes on, make yourself some gaiters out of it, because stockings are not warm. The Germans invented them in order to make more money. Petrovich loved on all occasions to have a fling at the Germans, but it is plain you must have a new cloak. At the word new, all grew dark before Akaki Akakievich's eyes, and everything in the room began to whirl round. The only thing he saw clearly was the general with the paper face on the lid of Petrovich's snuff-box. "A new one," said he, as if still in a dream. "Why, I have no money for that." "Yes, a new one," said Petrovich, with barbarous composure. "Well, if it came to a new one, you mean how much would it cost?" "Yes." "Well, you would have to lay out 150 or more," said Petrovich, and pursed up his lips significantly. He liked to produce powerful effects, liked to stun utterly and suddenly, and then to glance sideways to see what face the stunned person would put on the matter. 150 rubles for a cloak!" shrieked poor Akaki Akakievich, perhaps for the first time in his life, for his voice had always been distinguished for softness. "Yes, sir," said Petrovich, "for any kind of cloak. If you have a marten fur on the collar or a silk-lined hood, it will mount up to 200. "Petrovich, please," said Akaki Akakievich in a beseeching tone, not hearing and not trying to hear Petrovich's words and disregarding all his effects. "Some repairs, in order that it may wear yet a little longer." "No, it would only be a waste of time and money," said Petrovich, and Akaki Akakievich went away after these words, utterly discouraged. But Petrovich stood for some time after his departure, with significantly compressed lips, and without betaking himself to his work, satisfied that he would not be dropped, and an artistic tailor employed. Akaki Akakievich went out into the street as if in a dream. "Such an affair," he said to himself. "I did not think it had come to—" And then, after a pause, he added, "Well, so it is. See what it has come to at last, and I never imagined that it was so." Then followed a long silence, after which he exclaimed, "Well, so it is. See what already, nothing unexpected, that it would be nothing. What a strange circumstance." So saying, instead of going home, he went in exactly the opposite direction, without suspecting it. On the way, a chimney sweep bumped up against him and blackened his shoulder, and a whole hatful of rubbish landed on him from the top of a house which was building. He did not notice it, and only when he ran against a watchman who, having planted his halberd beside him, was shaking some snuff from his box into his horny hand, did he recover himself a little, and that because the watchman said, "Why are you poking yourself into a man's very face? Haven't you the pavement?" This caused him to look about him and turn towards home. There only, he finally began to collect his thoughts and to survey his position in its clear and actual light, and to argue with himself, sensibly and frankly, as with a reasonable friend, with whom one can discuss private and personal matters. "No," said Akaki Akakievich, "it is impossible to reason with Petrovich now. He is that. Evidently his wife has been beating him. I'd better go to him on Sunday morning. After Saturday night he will be a little cross-eyed and sleepy, for he will want to get drunk, and his wife won't give him any money, and at such a time a 10-kopeck piece in his hand he will become more fit to reason with, and then the cloak and that." Thus argued Akaki Akakievich with himself, regained his courage, and waited until the first Sunday, when, seeing from afar that Petrovich's wife had left the house, he went straight to him. Petrovich's eye was indeed very much askew after Saturday. His head drooped, and he was very sleepy. But for all that, as soon as he knew what it was a question of, it seemed as though Satan jogged his memory. "Impossible," said he. "Please to order a new one." Thereupon, Akaki Akakievich handed over the 10 kopeck piece. "Thank you, sir. I will drink your good health," said Petrovich. "But as for the cloak, don't trouble yourself about it. It is good for nothing. I will make you a capital new one, so let us settle about it now." Akaki Akakievich was still for mending it, but Petrovich would not hear of it, and said, "I shall certainly have to make you a new one, and you may depend upon it that I shall do my best. It may even be, as the fashion goes, that the collar can be fastened by silver hooks under a flap." Then Akaki Akakievich saw that it was impossible to get along without a new cloak, and his spirits sank utterly. How, in fact, was it to be done? Where was the money to come from? He must have some new trousers and pay a debt of long standing to the shoemaker for putting new tops to his old boots, and he must order 3 shirts from the seamstress and a couple of pieces of linen. In short, all his money must be spent, and even if the director should be so kind as to order him to receive 45 or even 50 rubles instead of 40, it would be a mere nothing, a mere drop in the ocean towards the funds necessary for a cloak, although he knew that Petrovich was often wrong-headed enough to blurt out some outrageous price, so that even his own wife could not refrain from exclaiming, "Have you lost your senses, you fool?" At one time he would not work at any price, and now it was quite likely that he had named a higher sum than the cloak would cost. But although he knew that Petrovich would undertake to make a cloak for 80 rubles, still, where was he to get the 80 rubles from? He might possibly manage half. Yes, half might be procured, but where was the other half to come from? But the reader must first be told where the first half came from. Akaki Akakievich had a habit of putting, for every ruble he spent, a groschen into a small box, fastened with lock and key, and with a slit in the top for the reception of money. At the end of every half-year he counted over the heap of coppers and changed it for silver. This he had done for a long time, and in the course of years the sum had mounted up to over 40 rubles. Thus he had one half on hand. But where was he to find the other half? Where was he to get another 40 rubles from? Akaki Akakievich thought, and decided that it would be necessary to curtail his ordinary expenses, for the space of 1 year at least, to dispense with tea in the evening, to burn no candles, and, if there was anything which he must do, to go into his landlady's room and work by her light. When he went into the street, he must walk as lightly as he could, and as cautiously upon the stones, almost upon tiptoe, in order not to wear his heels down in too short a time. He must give the laundress as little to wash as possible, and in order not to wear out his clothes, he must take them off as soon as he got home and wear only his cotton dressing-gown, which had been long and carefully saved. To tell the truth, it was a little hard for him at first to accustom himself to these deprivations, but he got used to them at length, after a fashion, and all went smoothly. He even got used to being hungry in the evening, but he made up for it by treating himself, so to say, in spirit, by bearing ever in mind the idea of his future cloak. From that time forth, his existence seemed to become, in some way, fuller, as if he were married, or as if some other man lived in him, as if, in fact, he were not alone, and some pleasant friend had consented to travel along life's path with him, the friend being no other than the cloak, with thick wadding and a strong lining, incapable of wearing out. He became more lively, and even his character grew firmer, like that of a man who has made up his mind and set himself a goal. From his face and gait, doubt and indecision, all hesitating and wavering, disappeared of themselves. Fire gleamed in his eyes, and occasionally the boldest and most daring ideas flitted through his mind. Why not, for instance, have marten fur on the collar? The thought of this almost made him absent-minded. Once, in copying a letter, he nearly made a mistake, so that he exclaimed almost aloud, "Ugh!" and crossed himself. Once, in the course of every month, he had a conference with Petrovich on the subject of the cloak, where it would be better to buy the cloth, and the colour, and the price. He always returned home satisfied, though troubled, reflecting that the time would come at last when it could all be bought, and then the cloak made. The affair progressed more briskly than he had expected, for beyond all his hopes, the director awarded neither 40 nor 45 rubles for Akaki Akakievich's share, but 60. Whether he suspected that Akaki Akakievich needed a cloak, or whether it was merely chance, at all events, 20 extra rubles were by this means provided. This circumstance hastened matters. 2 or 3 months more of hunger, and Akaki Akakievich had accumulated about 80 rubles. His heart, generally so quiet, began to throb. On the first possible day, he went shopping in company with Petrovich. They bought some very good cloth, and at a reasonable rate too, for they had been considering the matter for 6 months, and rarely let a month pass without their visiting the shops to inquire prices. Petrovich himself said that no better cloth could be had. For lining, they selected a cotton stuff, but so firm and thick that Petrovich declared it to be better than silk, and even prettier and more glossy. They did not buy the marten fur, because it was, in fact, dear, but in its stead they picked out the very best of cat skin which could be found in the shop, and which might indeed be taken for marten at a distance. Petrovich worked at the cloak 2 whole weeks, for there was a great deal of quilting. Otherwise it would have been finished sooner. He charged 12 rubles for the job. It could not possibly have been done for less. It was all sewed with silk, in small double seams, and Petrovich went over each seam afterwards with his own teeth, stamping in various patterns. It is difficult to say precisely on what day, but probably the most glorious one in Akaki Akakievich's life, when Petrovich at length brought home the cloak. He brought it in the morning, before the hour when it was necessary to start for the department. Never did a cloak arrive so exactly in the nick of time, for the severe cold had set in, and it seemed to threaten to increase. Petrovich brought the cloak himself, as befits a good tailor. On his countenance was a significant expression, such as Akaki Akakievich had never beheld there. He seemed fully sensible that he had done no small deed, and crossed a gulf, separating tailors who put in linings and execute repairs from those who make new things. He took the cloak out of the pocket-handkerchief in which he had brought it. The handkerchief was fresh from the laundress, and he put it in his pocket for use. Taking out the cloak, he gazed proudly at it, held it up with both hands, and flung it skillfully over the shoulders of Akaki Akakievich. Then he pulled it and fitted it down behind with his hand, and he draped it around Akaki Akakievich without buttoning it. Akaki Akakievich, like an experienced man, wished to try the sleeves. Petrovich helped him on with them, and it turned out that the sleeves were satisfactory also. In short, the cloak appeared to be perfect and most seasonable. Petrovich did not neglect to observe that it was only because he lived in a narrow street and had no signboard, and had known Akaki Akakievich so long that he had made it so cheaply, but that if he had been in business on the Nevsky Prospect, he would have charged 75 rubles for the making alone. Akaki Akakievich did not care to argue this point with Petrovich. He paid him, thanked him, and set out at once in his new cloak for the department. Petrovich followed him, and pausing in the street, gazed long at the cloak in the distance, after which he went to one side expressly to run through a crooked alley and emerge again into the street beyond, to gaze once more upon the cloak from another point, namely, directly in front. Meantime, Akaki Akakievich went on in holiday mood. He was conscious every second of the time that he had a new cloak on his shoulders, and several times he laughed with internal satisfaction. In fact, there were 2 advantages. One was its warmth, the other its beauty. He saw nothing of the road, but suddenly found himself at the department. He took off his cloak in the anteroom, looked it over carefully, and confided it to the special care of the attendant. It is impossible to say precisely how it was that everyone in the department knew at once that Akaki Akakievich had a new cloak, and that the cape no longer existed. All rushed at the same moment into the anteroom to inspect it. They congratulated him and said pleasant things to him, so that he began at first to smile and then to grow ashamed. When all surrounded him and said that the new cloak must be christened and that he must at least give them all a party, Akaki Akakievich lost his head completely and did not know where he stood, what to answer, or how to get out of it. He stood blushing all over for several minutes, trying to assure them with great simplicity that it was not a new cloak, that it was, in fact, the old cape. At length, one of the officials, assistant to the head clerk, in order to show that he was not at all proud and on good terms with his inferiors, said, "So be it. Only I will give the party instead of Akaki Akakievich. I invite you all to tea with me tonight. It just happens to be my name day, too." The officials naturally at once offered the assistant clerk their congratulations and accepted the invitation with pleasure. Akaki Akakievich would have declined, but all declared that it was discourteous, that it was simply a sin and a shame, and that he could not possibly refuse. Besides, the notion became pleasant to him when he recollected that he should thereby have a chance of wearing his new cloak in the evening also. That whole day was truly a most triumphant festival for Akaki Akakievich. He returned home in the most happy frame of mind, took off his cloak, and hung it carefully on the wall, admiring afresh the cloth and the lining. Then he brought out his old, worn-out cloak for comparison. He looked at it and laughed, so vast was the difference. And long after dinner he laughed again when the condition of the cape recurred to his mind. He dined cheerfully, and after dinner wrote nothing, but took his ease for a while on the bed until it got dark. Then he dressed himself leisurely, put on his cloak, and stepped out into the street. Where the host lived, unfortunately, we cannot say. Our memory begins to fail us badly. The houses and streets in St. Petersburg have become so mixed up in our head that it is very difficult to get anything out of it again in proper form. This much is certain, that the official lived in the best part of the city, and therefore it must have been anything but near to Akaki Akakievich's residence. Akaki Akakievich was first obliged to traverse a kind of wilderness of deserted, dimly lighted streets. But in proportion as he approached the official's quarter of the city, the streets became more lively, more populous, and more brilliantly illuminated. Pedestrians began to appear. Handsomely dressed ladies were more frequently encountered. The men had otter-skin collars to their coats. Shabby sleighmen with their wooden railed sledges, stuck over with brass-headed nails, became rarer, whilst on the other hand, more and more drivers in red velvet caps, lacquered sledges and bearskin coats began to appear, and carriages with rich hammercloths flew swiftly through the streets, their wheels scrunching the snow. Akaki Akakievich gazed upon all this as upon a novel sight. He had not been in the streets during the evening for years. He halted out of curiosity before a shop window to look at a picture representing a handsome woman who had thrown off her shoe, thereby baring her whole foot in a very pretty way, whilst behind her the head of a man with whiskers and a handsome moustache peeped through the doorway of another room. Akaki Akakievich shook his head and laughed, and then went on his way. Why did he laugh? Either because he had met with a thing utterly unknown, but for which everyone cherishes, nevertheless, some sort of feeling, or else he thought, like many officials, "Well, those French, what is to be said? If they do go in for anything of that sort, why—" But possibly he did not think at all. Akaki Akakievich at length reached the house in which the head clerk's assistant lodged. He lived in fine style. The staircase was lit by a lamp, his apartment being on the second floor. On entering the vestibule, Akaki Akakievich beheld a whole row of galoshes on the floor. Among them, in the center of the room, stood a samovar, humming and emitting clouds of steam. On the walls hung all sorts of coats and cloaks, among which there were even some with beaver collars or velvet facings. Beyond, the buzz of conversation was audible and became clear and loud when the servant came out with a trayful of empty glasses, cream jugs, and sugar bowls. It was evident that the officials had arrived long before and had already finished their first glass of tea. Akaki Akakievich, having hung up his own cloak, entered the inner room. Before him, all at once appeared lights, officials, pipes, and card tables, and he was bewildered by a sound of rapid conversation rising from all the tables and the noise of moving chairs. He halted very awkwardly in the middle of the room, wondering what he ought to do. But they had seen him. They received him with a shout, and all thronged at once into the anteroom, and there took another look at his cloak. Akaki Akakievich, although somewhat confused, was frank-hearted, and could not refrain from rejoicing when he saw how they praised his cloak. Then, of course, they all dropped him and his cloak, and returned, as was proper, to the tables set out for whist. All this, the noise, the talk, and the throng of people, was rather overwhelming to Akaki Akakievich. He simply did not know where he stood, or where to put his hands, his feet, and his whole body. Finally, he sat down by the players, looked at the cards, gazed at the face of one and another, and after a while began to gape, and to feel that it was wearisome, the more so, as the hour was already long past when he usually went to bed. He wanted to take leave of the host, but they would not let him go, saying that he must not fail to drink a glass of champagne in honor of his new garment. In the course of an hour, supper, consisting of vegetable salad, cold veal, pastry, confectioner's pies, and champagne, was served. They made Akaki Akakievich drink 2 glasses of champagne, after which he felt things grow livelier. Still, he could not forget that it was 12 o'clock, and that he should have been at home long ago. In order that the host might not think of some excuse for detaining him, he stole out of the room quickly, sought out, in the anteroom, his cloak, which, to his sorrow, he found lying on the floor, brushed it, picked off every speck upon it, put it on his shoulders, and descended the stairs to the street. In the street, all was still bright. Some petty shops, those permanent clubs of servants and all sorts of folks, were open. Others were shut, but nevertheless showed a streak of light the whole length of the door crack, indicating that they were not yet free of company, and that probably some domestics, male and female, were finishing their stories and conversations whilst leaving their masters in complete ignorance as to their whereabouts. Akaki Akakievich went on in a happy frame of mind. He even started to run, without knowing why, after some lady who flew past like a flash of lightning. But he stopped short and went on very quietly as before, wondering why he had quickened his pace. Soon there spread before him these deserted streets, which are not cheerful in the daytime, to say nothing of the evening. Now they were even more dim and lonely. The lanterns began to grow rarer. Oil, evidently, had been less liberally supplied. Then came wooden houses and fences. Not a soul anywhere. Only the snow sparkled in the streets and mournfully veiled the low-roofed cabins with their closed shutters. He approached the spot where the street crossed a vast square with houses barely visible on its farther side, a square which seemed a fearful desert. Afar, a tiny spark glimmered from some watchman's box, which seemed to stand on the edge of the world. Akaki Akakievich's cheerfulness diminished at this point in a marked degree. He entered the square, not without an involuntary sensation of fear, as though his heart warned him of some evil. He glanced back, and on both sides it was like a sea about him. No, it is better not to look, he thought, and went on, closing his eyes. When he opened them, to see whether he was near the end of the square, he suddenly beheld, standing just before his very nose, some bearded individuals of precisely what sort he could not make out. All grew dark before his eyes, and his heart throbbed. "Of course, the cloak is mine," said one of them in a loud voice, seizing hold of his collar. Akaki Akakievich was about to shout, "Help!" when the second man thrust a fist, about the size of an official's head, at his very mouth, muttering, "Just you dare to scream!" Akaki Akakievich felt them strip off his cloak and give him a kick. He fell headlong upon the snow and felt no more. In a few minutes he recovered consciousness and rose to his feet, but no one was there. He felt that it was cold in the square and that his cloak was gone. He began to shout, but his voice did not appear to reach the outskirts of the square. In despair, but without ceasing to shout, he started at a run across the square, straight towards the watchbox, beside which stood the watchman, leaning on his halberd, and apparently curious to know what kind of a customer was running towards him, shouting. Akaki Akakievich ran up to him and began in a sobbing voice to shout that he was asleep and attended to nothing, and did not see when a man was robbed. The watchman replied that he had seen two men stop him in the middle of the square, but supposed that they were friends of his, and that, instead of scolding vainly, he had better go to the police on the morrow so that they might make a search for whoever had stolen the cloak. Akaki Akakievich ran home and arrived in a state of complete disorder, his hair, which grew very thinly upon his temples, and the back of his head all tousled, his body, arms and legs, covered with snow. The old woman, who was mistress of his lodgings, on hearing a terrible knocking, sprang hastily from her bed, and with only one shoe on, ran to open the door, pressing the sleeve of her chemise to her bosom out of modesty. But when she had opened it, she fell back on beholding Akaki Akakievich in such a condition. When he told her about the affair, she clasped her hands and said that he must go straight to the district chief of police, for his subordinate would turn up his nose, promise well, and drop the matter there. The very best thing to do, therefore, would be to go to the district chief, whom she knew, because Finnish Anna, her former cook, was now nurse at his house. She often saw him passing the house, and he was at church every Sunday, praying, but at the same time gazing cheerfully at everybody, so that he must be a good man, judging from all appearances. Having listened to this opinion, Akaki Akakievich betook himself sadly to his room. And how he spent the night there, anyone who can put himself in another's place may readily imagine. Early in the morning, he presented himself at the district chief's, but was told the official was asleep. He went again at 10 and was again informed that he was asleep. At 11, and they said, "The superintendent is not at home." At dinner time, and the clerks in the anteroom would not admit him on any terms, and insisted upon knowing his business. So that at last, for once in his life, Akaki Akakievich felt an inclination to show some spirit, and said curtly that he must see the chief in person, that they ought not to presume to refuse him entrance, that he came from the Department of Justice, and that when he complained of them, they would see. The clerks dared make no reply to this, and one of them went to call the chief, who listened to the strange story of the theft of the coat. Instead of directing his attention to the principal points of the matter, he began to question Akaki Akakievich. Why was he going home so late? Was he in the habit of doing so, or had he been to some disorderly house? So that Akaki Akakievich got thoroughly confused and left him without knowing whether the affair of his cloak was in proper train or not. All that day, for the first time in his life, he never went near the department. The next day he made his appearance, very pale, and in his old cape, which had become even more shabby. The news of the robbery of the cloak touched many, although there were some officials present who never lost an opportunity, even such a one as the present, of ridiculing Akaki Akakievich. They decided to make a collection for him on the spot, but the officials had already spent a great deal in subscribing for the director's portrait and for some book at the suggestion of the head of that division, who was a friend of the author, and so the sum was trifling. One of them, moved by pity, resolved to help Akaki Akakievich with some good advice at least, and told him that he ought not to go to the police, for although it might happen that a police officer, wishing to win the approval of his superiors, might hunt up the cloak by some means, still his cloak would remain in the possession of the police if he did not offer legal proof that it belonged to him. The best thing for him, therefore, would be to apply to a certain prominent personage, since this prominent personage, by entering into relation with the proper persons, could greatly expedite the matter. As there was nothing else to be done, Akaki Akakievich decided to go to the prominent personage. What was the exact official position of the prominent personage remains unknown to this day. The reader must know that the prominent personage had but recently become a prominent personage, having up to that time been only an insignificant person. Moreover, his present position was not considered prominent in comparison with others still more so. But there is always a circle of people to whom what is insignificant in the eyes of others is important enough. Moreover, he strove to increase his importance by sundry devices. For instance, he managed to have the inferior officials meet him on the staircase when he entered upon his service. No one was to presume to come directly to him, but the strictest etiquette must be observed. The collegiate recorder must make a report to the government secretary to the titular councillor, or whatever other man was proper, and all business must come before him in this manner. In Holy Russia, all is thus contaminated with the love of imitation. Every man imitates and copies his superior. They even say that a certain titular councillor, when promoted to the head of some small separate office, immediately partitioned off a private room for himself, called it the audience chamber, and posted at the door a lackey with red collar and braid, who grasped the handle of the door and opened to all comers, though the audience chamber would hardly hold an ordinary writing table. The manners and customs of the prominent personage were grand and imposing, but rather exaggerated. The main foundation of his system was strictness. Strictness, strictness, and always strictness, he generally said. And at the last word he looked significantly into the face of the person to whom he spoke. But there was no necessity for this, for the half-score of subordinates who formed the entire force of the office were properly afraid. On catching sight of him afar off, they left their work and waited, drawn up in line, until he had passed through the room. His ordinary converse with his inferiors smacked of sternness and consisted chiefly of 3 phrases. How dare you? Do you know whom you're speaking to? Do you realize who is standing before you? Otherwise, he was a very kind-hearted man, good to his comrades, and ready to oblige. But the rank of general threw him completely off his balance. On receiving anyone of that rank, he became confused, lost his way, as it were, and never knew what to do. If he chanced to be amongst his equals, he was still a very nice kind of man, a very good fellow in many respects, and not stupid, but the very moment that he found himself in the society of people but one rank lower than himself, he became silent. And his situation aroused sympathy, the more so, as he felt himself that he might have been making an incomparably better use of his time. In his eyes, there was sometimes visible a desire to join some interesting conversation or group, but he was kept back by the thought, would it not be a very great condescension on his part? Would it not be familiar? And would he not thereby lose his importance? And in consequence of such reflections, he always remained in the same dumb state, uttering from time to time a few monosyllabic sounds, and thereby earning the name of the most wearisome of men. To this prominent personage, Akaki Akakievich presented himself, and this at the most unfavorable time for himself, though opportune for the prominent personage. The prominent personage was in his cabinet, conversing very gaily with an old acquaintance and companion of his childhood, whom he had not seen for several years, and who had just arrived when it was announced to him that a person named Bashmachkin had come. He asked abruptly, "Who is he?" "Some official," he was informed. "Ah, he can wait. This is no time for him to call," said the important man. It must be remarked here that the important man lied outrageously. He had said all he had to say to his friend long before, and the conversation had been interspersed for some time with very long pauses, during which they merely slapped each other on the leg and said, "You think so, Ivan Abramovich." "Just so, Stepan Valamovich." Nevertheless, he ordered that the official should be kept waiting, in order to show his friend, a man who had not been in the service for a long time, but had lived at home in the country, how long officials had to wait in his anteroom. At length, having talked himself completely out, and more than that, having had his fill of pauses and smoked a cigar in a very comfortable armchair with reclining back, he suddenly seemed to recollect and said to the secretary, who stood by the door with papers of reports, "So it seems that there is an official waiting to see me. Tell him that he may come in." On perceiving Akaki Akakievich's modest mien and his worn uniform, he turned abruptly to him and said, "What do you want?" in a curt, hard voice which he had practiced in his room in private and before the looking-glass for a whole week before being raised to his present rank. Akaki Akakievich, who was already imbued with a due amount of fear, became somewhat confused, and as well as his tongue would permit, explained with a rather more frequent addition than usual of the word that his cloak was quite new and had been stolen in the most inhuman manner, that he had applied to him in order that he might, in some way, by his intermediation, that he might enter into correspondence with the chief of police and find the cloak. For some inexplicable reason, this conduct seemed familiar to the prominent personage. "What, my dear sir," he said abruptly, "are you not acquainted with etiquette? To whom have you come? Don't you know how such matters are managed? You should first have presented a petition to the office. It would have gone to the head of the department, then to the chief of the division, then it would have been handed over to the secretary, and the secretary would have given it to me." "But, Your Excellency," said Akaki Akakievich, trying to collect his small handful of wits and conscious at the same time that he was perspiring terribly, "I, Your Excellency, presume to trouble you because secretaries are an untrustworthy race." What?" said the important personage. "Where did you get such courage? Where did you get such ideas? What impudence towards their chiefs and superiors has spread among the young generation?" The prominent personage apparently had not observed that Akaki Akakievich was already in the neighborhood of 50. If he could be called a young man, it must have been in comparison with someone who was 70. "Do you know to whom you're speaking? Do you realize who is standing before you? Do you realize it? Do you realize it? I ask you." Then he stamped his foot and raised his voice to such a pitch that it would have frightened even a different man from Akaki Akakievich. Akaki Akakievich's senses failed him. He staggered, trembled in every limb, and if the porters had not run in to support him, would have fallen to the floor. They carried him out insensible, but the prominent personage, gratified that the effect should have surpassed his expectations, and quite intoxicated with the thought that his word could even deprive a man of his senses, glanced sideways at his friend in order to see how he looked upon this, and perceived, not without satisfaction, that his friend was in a most uneasy frame of mind, and even beginning on his part to feel a trifle frightened. Akaki Akakievich could not remember how he descended the stairs and got into the street. He felt neither his hands nor feet. Never in his life had he been so rated by any high official, let alone a strange one. He went staggering on through the snowstorm which was blowing in the streets, with his mouth wide open. The wind, in St. Petersburg fashion, darted upon him from all quarters and down every cross-street. In a twinkling it had blown a quinsy into his throat, and he reached home unable to utter a word. His throat was swollen, and he lay down on his bed. So powerful is sometimes a good scolding. The next day a violent fever developed. Thanks to the generous assistance of the St. Petersburg climate, the malady progressed more rapidly than could have been expected, and when the doctor arrived, he found, on feeling the sick man's pulse, that there was nothing to be done except to prescribe a poultice so that the patient might not be left entirely without the beneficent aid of medicine. But at the same time, he predicted his end in 36 hours. After this, he turned to the landlady and said, "And as for you, don't waste your time on him. Order his pine coffin now. For an oak, one will be too expensive for him." Did Akaki Akakievich hear these fatal words? And if he heard them, did they produce any overwhelming effect upon him? Did he lament the bitterness of his life? We know not, for he continued in a delirious condition. Visions incessantly appeared to him, each stranger than the other. Now he saw Petrovich and ordered him to make a cloak with some traps for robbers who seemed to him to be always under the bed, and he cried every moment to the landlady to pull one of them from under his coverlet. Then he inquired why his old mantle hung before him when he had a new cloak. Next, he fancied that he was standing before the prominent person, listening to a thorough setting down and saying, "Forgive me, Your Excellency." But at last he began to curse, uttering the most horrible words, so that his aged landlady crossed herself, never in her life having heard anything of the kind from him, and more so as these words followed directly after the words, "Your Excellency." Later on he talked utter nonsense, of which nothing could be made, all that was evident being that these incoherent words and thoughts hovered ever about one thing, his cloak. At length, poor Akaki Akakievich breathed his last. They sealed up neither his room nor his effects, because in the first place there were no heirs, and in the second there was very little to inherit beyond a bundle of goose quills, a quire of white official paper, 3 pairs of socks, 2 or 3 buttons which had burst off his trousers, and the mantle already known to the reader. To whom all this fell, God knows. I confess that the person who told me this tale took no interest in the matter. They carried Akaki Akakievich out and buried him, and St. Petersburg was left without Akaki Akakievich, as though he had never lived there. A being disappeared, who was protected by none, dear to none, interesting to none, and who never even attracted to himself the attention of those students of human nature who omit no opportunity of thrusting a pin through a common fly and examining it under the microscope. A being who bore meekly the gibes of the department, and went to his grave without having done one unusual deed, but to whom, nevertheless, at the close of his life, appeared a bright visitant in the form of a cloak, which momentarily cheered his poor life, and upon him, thereafter, an intolerable misfortune descended, just as it descends upon the heads of the mighty of this world. Several days after his death, the porter was sent from the department to his lodgings, with an order for him to present himself there immediately, the chief commanding it. But the porter had to return unsuccessful, with the answer that he could not come. And to the question, "Why?" replied, "Well, because he is dead. He was buried 4 days ago." In this manner did they hear of Akaki Akakievich's death at the department, and the next day a new official sat in his place, with a handwriting by no means so upright, but more inclined and slanting. But who could have imagined that this was not really the end of Akaki Akakievich, that he was destined to raise a commotion after death, as if in compensation for his utterly insignificant life? But so it happened, and our poor story unexpectedly gains a fantastic ending. A rumor suddenly spread through St. Petersburg that a dead man had taken to appearing on the Kalinkin Bridge and its vicinity at night in the form of an official seeking a stolen cloak, and that, under the pretext of its being the stolen cloak, he dragged, without regard to rank or calling, everyone's cloak from his shoulders, be it catskin, beaver, fox, bear, sable, in a word, every sort of fur and skin which men adopted for their covering. One of the department officials saw the dead man with his own eyes and immediately recognized in him Akaki Akakievich. This, however, inspired him with such terror that he ran off with all his might, and therefore did not scan the dead man closely, but only saw how the latter threatened him from afar with his finger. Constant complaints poured in from all quarters that the backs and shoulders, not only of titular, but even of court councillors, were exposed to the danger of a cold on account of the frequent dragging off of their cloaks. Arrangements were made by the police to catch the corpse, alive or dead at any cost, and punish him as an example to others in the most severe manner. In this they nearly succeeded, for a watchman, on guard in Kirinshkin Lane, caught the corpse by the collar on the very scene of his evil deeds when attempting to pull off the frieze cloak of a retired musician. Having seized him by the collar, he summoned, with a shout, 2 of his comrades, whom he enjoined to hold him fast, while he himself felt for a moment in his boot in order to draw out his snuff-box and refresh his frozen nose. But the snuff was of a sort which even a corpse could not endure. The watchman, having closed his right nostril with his finger, had no sooner succeeded in holding half a handful up to the left than the corpse sneezed so violently that he completely filled the eyes of all 3. While they raised their hands to wipe them, the dead man vanished completely, so that they positively did not know whether they had actually had him in their grip at all. Thereafter, the watchmen conceived such a terror of dead men that they were afraid even to seize the living, and only screamed from a distance, "Hey there! Go your way!" So the dead official began to appear even beyond the Kalinkin Bridge, causing no little terror to all timid people. But we have totally neglected that certain prominent personage who may really be considered as the cause of the fantastic turn taken by this true history. First of all, justice compels us to say that after the departure of poor, annihilated Akaki Akakievich, he felt something like remorse. Suffering was unpleasant to him, for his heart was accessible to many good impulses, in spite of the fact that his rank often prevented his showing his true self. As soon as his friend had left his cabinet, he began to think about poor Akaki Akakievich, and from that day forth, poor Akaki Akakievich, who could not bear up under an official reprimand, recurred to his mind almost every day. The thought troubled him to such an extent that a week later he even resolved to send an official to him, to learn whether he really could assist him. And when it was reported to him that Akaki Akakievich had died suddenly of fever, he was startled, hearkened to the reproaches of his conscience, and was out of sorts for the whole day. Wishing to divert his mind in some way and drive away the disagreeable impression, he set out that evening for one of his friends' houses, where he found quite a large party assembled. What was better, nearly everyone was of the same rank as himself, so that he need not feel in the least constrained. This had a marvelous effect upon his mental state. He grew expansive, made himself agreeable in conversation. In short, he passed a delightful evening. After supper, he drank a couple of glasses of champagne, not a bad recipe for cheerfulness, as everyone knows. The champagne inclined him to various adventures, and he determined not to return home, but to go and see a certain well-known lady of German extraction, Karolina Ivanovna, a lady, it appears, with whom he was on a very friendly footing. It must be mentioned that the prominent personage was no longer a young man, but a good husband and respected father of a family. Two sons, one of whom was already in the service, and a good-looking 16-year-old daughter with a slightly arched but pretty little nose, came every morning to kiss his hand and say, "Bonjour, Papa." His wife, a still fresh and good-looking woman, first gave him her hand to kiss, and then, reversing the procedure, kissed his. But the prominent personage, though perfectly satisfied in his domestic relations, considered it stylish to have a friend in another quarter of the city. This friend was scarcely prettier or younger than his wife, but there are such puzzles in the world, and it is not our place to judge them. So the important personage descended the stairs, stepped into his sledge, said to the coachman, "To Karolina Ivanovna's," and wrapping himself luxuriously in his warm cloak, found himself in that delightful frame of mind than which a Russian can conceive nothing better, namely, when you think of nothing yourself, yet when the thoughts creep into your mind of their own accord, each more agreeable than the other, giving you no trouble either to drive them away or seek them. Fully satisfied, he recalled all the gay features of the evening just past and all the mots which had made the little circle laugh. Many of them he repeated in a low voice and found them quite as funny as before, so it is not surprising that he should laugh heartily at them. Occasionally, however, he was interrupted by gusts of wind, which, coming suddenly, God knows whence or why, cut his face, drove masses of snow into it, filled out his cloak collar like a sail, or suddenly blew it over his head with supernatural force, and thus caused him constant trouble to disentangle himself. Suddenly, the important personage felt someone clutch him firmly by the collar. Turning round, he perceived a man of short stature, in an old, worn uniform, and recognized, not without terror, Akaki Akakievich. The official's face was white as snow, and looked just like a corpse's. But the horror of the important personage transcended all bounds when he saw the dead man's mouth open, and heard it utter the following remarks, while it breathed upon him the terrible odor of the grave. "Ah, here you are at last. I have you, that by the collar. I need your cloak. You took no trouble about mine, but reprimanded me. So now give up your own." The pallid, prominent personage almost died of fright, brave as he was in the office and in the presence of inferiors generally. And although, at the sight of his manly form and appearance, everyone said, "Ah, how much character he has." At this crisis, he, like many possessed of an heroic exterior, experienced such terror that not without cause he began to fear an attack of illness. He flung his cloak hastily from his shoulders and shouted to his coachman in an unnatural voice, "Home at full speed!" The coachman, hearing the tone which is generally employed at critical moments, and even accompanied by something much more tangible, drew his head down between his shoulders in case of an emergency, flourished his whip, and flew on like an arrow. In a little more than 6 minutes, the prominent personage was at the entrance of his own house. Pale, thoroughly scared, and cloakless, he went home instead of to Karolina Ivanovna's, reached his room somehow or other, and passed the night in the direst distress, so that the next morning over their tea his daughter had said, "You are very pale today, Papa." But Papa remained silent, and said not a word to anyone of what had happened to him, where he had been, or where he had intended to go. This occurrence made a deep impression upon him. He even began to say, "How dare you? Do you realize who is standing before you?" Less frequently to the under-officials, and if he did utter the words, it was only after first having learned the bearings of the matter. But the most noteworthy point was that from that day forward the apparition of the dead official ceased to be seen. Evidently the prominent personage's cloak just fitted his shoulders. At all events, no more instances of his dragging cloaks from people's shoulders were heard of. But many active and solicitous persons could by no means reassure themselves, and asserted that the dead official still showed himself in distant parts of the city. In fact, one watchman in Koloman saw with his own eyes the apparition come from behind a house. But the watchman was not a strong man, so he was afraid to arrest him, and followed him in the dark, until, at length, the apparition looked round, paused, and inquired, "What do you want?" at the same time showing such a fist as is never seen on living men. The watchman said, "Nothing," and turned back instantly. But the apparition was much too tall, wore huge moustaches, and directing its steps apparently towards the Obukhov bridge, disappeared in the darkness of the night.